So first, let us know the historical background of the gender studies. So gender studies developed alongside and emerged out of women's studies, which consolidated as an academic field of inquiry in the 1970s. The field of gender and women's studies emerged from the contemporary feminist movements. So it was triggered by the second wave of feminism, with the initial goal of bringing women and their experiences more full in knowledge. So initially, these programs were essentially feminist, designed to recognize contributions made by women as well as by men. So the move towards gender studies in the 1990s and into the 21st century has not been welcomed by everyone who works on gender issues. So, for example, Braidotti of 1994 pointed out way in which gender studies could be seen as taking over women's studies and feminist achievements and de-radicalizing the women's movement by suggesting a post-feminist world where men's studies and masculinity were more important areas of research. Next, the first two women's and gender studies in the United States were established in 1970 at San Diego State College, or now called as SDSU, or San Diego State University. So the SDSU program was initiated after a year of intense organizing of women's consciousness raising groups, rallies, petitions circulating, and operating in efficient and experimental classes and presentations before 7 committees and assemblies. The shifts in the transmission from women's studies to gender studies also reflects changes in the ways in which issues of gender and sexuality have been woven into interdisciplinary studies. So this remains a tension between mainstreaming and the suggestion battles have been won in relation to gender equality and the expansion of gender studies as an important interdisciplinary field of research. Many educational departments changed their name from Women's Studies to Gender Studies, making it more comprehensive program by taking into account various other aspects of gender as well. So most of the program are now branded as Gender Studies or Gender and Women's Studies. So the pragmatic reason for this is that it is seen as less feminist, more respectable, and less threatening than women's studies. So gender, therefore, has come to seem a safe and neutral term. So gender studies is also seen as more inclusive than women's studies. So it is taking in men and women as well as those who identify as neither. So gender studies looks at the different perspective of gender. So today, gender studies includes women's studies concerning women, feminism, gender and politics, men's studies, as well as queer studies.
Now let's move on to the proponents of gender approach to literature or gender criticism. First is Emily Dickinson. Her works were influenced by the women's rights movement. Majority of her works were produced between 1858 to 1866, and it was her way to break away from social conventions. Yes, writing, but not only for Emily Dickinson, also for a lot of women from this time. They considered writing as their voice so that they can express their feelings and express themselves. Her work, I Gave Myself to Him, is a piece that illustrates marriage as a solemn contract where a woman exchanges herself for financial security and depicts a husband as nothing more than a customer. Let's move on to Robert Bly. He gained attention for his efforts to help men reclaim their healthy masculinity. Together with James Hillman and Michael Meade, they provided seminars for men which encouraged them to reclaim their male traits and express their repressed feelings. His book, Iron John, a book about men, is about modern men who are greatly damaged by the absence of intergenerational male models and initiation rituals. Next is Simone de Beauvoir. She wanted women to be free to choose themselves. She said that justifying one's existence affects men and women differently. And her work, or her treatise, The Second Sex, is about a passionate plea for the abolition of what she called the myth of eternal feminine. Last but not the least is Virginia Woolf. She's considered to be the founder of modern feminist literary criticism. She's championed today for steadily calling attention to women's issues, because then again, she was in a time when women were only given a few rights. And her work, A Room of One's Own, is about the issues of the patriarchal system preventing women to realize their full and creative potential.
Gender studies. What is it about? Gender studies. It is dedicated to the study of feminine, masculine, and LGBT identity. An interdisciplinary approach is used for the study of gender and the intersection of gender with other categories of identity such as ethnicity, sexuality, class, and nationality. Although some of the major methodologies adopted in gender studies are inspired by feminist criticism, a wide array of theoretical approaches are brought into play to study the categories of gender. Some of the areas in which research is conducted, focusing on gender politics, identity, and representation, include the 19th and 20th century German literature, Francophone, Caribbean, and French medieval literature, contemporary Chinese literature, performing arts and film, Italian female autobiography.
Good day. I am Riza Mae Tanghiyan, your next reporter. So, for today, I will tackle about how to use gender studies, as the previous reporters discusses all about gender studies history, etymology, and what is gender studies all about. So, but first, let's know why we study gender studies. Why? Gender studies gives language and voice to social inequalities, process, conditions, arrangements, and rituals that can otherwise go unspoken and unnamed. This is what Deborah Cohen, a sociology professor at University of South Carolina, Beaufort, wrote in an email. Gender studies focuses on ways gender, identity, and sexual orientation shape behaviors and feelings, and it investigates power dynamics that relate to sex. This field includes men's studies, women's studies, and queer studies, and occasionally addresses widespread social concerns such as domestic violence. The academic discipline also investigates causes of sex-based discrimination and harassment and solutions to the problem. In gender studies term, gender is often used to refer to the social and cultural construction of masculinity and femininity, and not to the state of being male or female in entirety. So that's all why we study gender. Next is, what can you do or with a gender studies degree, or how to use gender studies. Gender studies degree recipients often choose to work at advocacy organizations and charities that frequently assist women, such as domestic violence shelters or similar groups that help lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender individuals, or LGBT. An undergraduate degree in gender studies can also provide preparation for graduate school in wide array fields including medicine. Gender studies grads frequently become lawyers, social workers, or therapists. Having gender studies major doesn't mean you have to pursue a career that relates to gender, says Howie. Since someone with this type of liberal arts education can do variety of jobs with this type of jobs that involve critical thinking. Howie also notes that many gender focuses non-profit roles pay low wages. But one lucrative way to use gender studies degree and focus directly on sex equity issues, she says, is to provide strategic advice to companies on how they can promote fairness in the workplace and guard against sex-based bias. And also, a degree in gender studies cultivate person's empathy and creativity. How it says, adding that an understanding of gender and race issues is crucial for success in the modern business world. And he quoted, "You really can't run a business today if you are clueless about those things."
I'm Kenneth from Group 7, and I will be the presenter to cite sample analysis paper in gender studies. Among many topics and studies that I research, I only pick 3 sample analyses. First is the scientific production in psychology, a gender study analysis, the discourse of gender in sports from femininity to feminism, and lastly is the patriarchy of and woman's subordination, a theoretical analysis. The first sample that I found is the scientific production in psychology, a gender analysis. This study aims to identify possible gender inequalities and the scholarly output of the researcher in the field of psychology in Spain. The presence of women, the collaborative pattern, and the impact of this scientific publication were analyzed. The results shown that the average number of female researchers per paper was 0.42 and that 42.3% of the papers had a female researchers as a first author. Moreover, the proportion of female authors of a paper was statistically significantly higher when the first author was a female. Feminism in the field of research is shown in this research. I think that this research was to show how female impacts on the field of researching. It also makes me think about Marie Curie, who was deceased due to her dedication to her research. It was said that exposure to her radioactive work made her ill. A woman was not really recognized at early times, and education, for example in Poland, at Curie's time, was not available for girls. The second research is the discourse of gender in sport from femininity to feminism. So, this argument, this argument presented here is that the sociology discourse of gender in sports, in other words, the way the topic is approached, the assumptions surrounding its investigation, and the way it is which new knowledge is generated has been determined without sufficient recognition of its own ideological. The paper reviews the development of the gender in sport discourse from its origin is socially, psychologically research that focus on the supposed conflict between femininity and athleticism. This is to tackle about the feminism and what they can do. Competition and athletics should be inclusive. Both gender can do what one can do. Therefore, equality in sports can also be implemented. What guys can do can girls do and vice versa. The limitation to one's gender is inevitable, but the chance to try should always be considered for both genders. I think that this cites, for example, basketball for girls and ballet for guys. Lastly is the patriarchy and the woman's subordination, a theoretical analysis. Patriarchy is the prime obstacle to women's advancement and development. Despite differences in levels of domination, the broad principle remains the same. For example, men are in control. The nature of this control may differ, so it is necessary to understand the system, which keeps the woman dominated and subordinated, and to unravel its working in its order to work for women's development in a systematic way. Patriarchy refers to the male domination in both public and private spheres. In this way, feminists use the term patriarchy to describe the power relationship between men and women as well as to find out the root cause of the woman's subordination. This makes me remember about the times in the Philippines where girls are for purpose of marrying and staying at home, when women have no rights for education and are always under the command of their husbands. And I think that this is why feminism is born, to advocate for women's rights on the basis of equality and success. So that's all for this report and the sample analysis paper and the field of gender studies. Thank you.
The history of queer. The word queer has been used to refer to individuals considered odd or outside social norms. In the 1960s and 1970s, a new social movement called for the rejection of labels like gay and lesbian. Queer was most commonly used for reasons of perceived sexual or gender nonconformity. The term queer was reclaimed in the 1990s by militant and creative LGBT activities and academic scholars. Groundbreaking manifestos and theoretical texts offered social alternatives to the normative terms of heterosexuality. Queer indexed a range of practices and identities that strayed from the ideas of the heterosexual family. In the 1990s, queer has emerged as an influential mode of thought in the ongoing debate about empowerment issues. So historian Liza Mae argues that queer theory rejections of liberal humanism pose unwelcome challenges. Kathy Cohen argues that the binary of heterosexual versus homosexual ignores interplay of the race, gender, and class. These approaches to queer did not isolate lesbian or gay identities, but neither did they leave those categories behind. Historical roots of queer are traced from the homosexual rights movement through the gay liberation movement.
Hello guys, let's talk about the study of queer and how does it use. So, what is queer? The word queer holds in its history both pain and empowerment. It has been a dagger and a hag, a dismissal and a welcome sign, a put down and a motivation to stand up and march. The definition of it first showed up in English about 1513. Queer has always meant something not normal, something peculiar, something odd. Counterfeit money was queer. Someone who's sick might say they feel queer. Playground bullies would call someone queer without knowing or intending any sexual connotation. And also, it's often used as an umbrella term to denote sexual identity within a particular community. A queer. The Oxford English Dictionary says that the noun queer was first used to mean homosexual by the Marquess of Queensberry in 1894. The Concise New Patrick's Dictionary of Slang says the adjective queer began to mean homosexual about 1914, mostly in the United States, and notes it was derogatory from the outside, not from the within, a hint that it was being embraced as a self-description even then. Dictionary shows a progression for queer. The 1949 printing of Webster News Collegiate Dictionary lists just one slang usage of queer counterfeit money. And so, the 1965 printing of Webster New Dictionary College Edition lists queer noun and adjective as slang for homosexual. Not offensive slang, just slang. So, what was happening then? It was the gay rights movement, spurred in part by the AIDS epidemic. Some sources trace the first adoption of queer as a positive sub-label to the group Queer Nation, founded in the early 1990s as a radical organization to combat violence against homosexuals. Since then, queer has expanded beyond meaning only homosexual. In fact, queer does not have a single meaning, except perhaps not heterosexual. Some people who identify as neither male nor female call themselves genderqueer, while others who identify the same way might call themselves gender fluid or non-binary. Even the Q in LGBTQ could stand for either queer or questioning. Queer is a label, one adopted by some people, rejected by others, so it can't be used to describe individuals, a group of specific individuals, or their gender orientations unless their preference is known. And it's still sting. As the AP style book says, queer is acceptable for people and organizations that use the term to identify themselves. Do not use it when intended as a slur. So what is slur? So it is defined as to speak clearly or to speak quickly or not to pronounce words distinctly. Like for example, is the way a very drunk person will talk.
Hello everyone, now we'll be talking about queer studies and what is it about. What is queer? Description of sexuality that rejects normative definitions of appropriate feminine and masculine sexual behavior. More contemporary meanings of queer have been picked up and used by activists and academics to mark movements within sexual identity politics and theoretical frameworks for understanding gender and sexuality. Queer, however, is a contested term. Scholars and activists constantly disagree on what queer means and the way in which it should be used. Queer is often used as an umbrella term to denote sexual identity within a particular community. A queer community may be made up of people who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and so on. Some find queer an easy way to describe such a large community. Labeling people whose sexual identities fall outside of heterosexuality may create solidarity among people based on commonality, which may in turn encourage them to identify with one another and create a community in which they find support and organize to initiate a political movement. What is queer studies? Queer studies is an interdisciplinary minor that invites students to explore basic questions about gender, sexual identities, and social justice while examining the diverse experiences of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgenders, and allied people in various cultures and communities, as well as across historical eras. The intersection of gender and sexuality with race and ethnicity, social class, language, and disability permeates the curriculum. Class topics range from film, sports, and fashion to discourse, politics, and theory. It introduces students to a dynamic interdisciplinary field that explores the LGBTQ lives and the evolving landscape of gender, sexualities, and identities. Queer studies helps students understand the diversity of LGBTQ communities, the history and present conditions of sexual identity information, and the function of ideologies of sexuality.
Good day everyone, and to you Mr. Chan. I am Rico Josef Santillan, and we're gonna report on the analysis paper that undergoes queer studies. So on that particular focus, which is queer study, I only accumulate one that has the most significance and most relevant to the current situation, entitled Introduction to the Special Issue Challenges of LGBT Research in the 21st Century. So here is my analysis. This research addressed the lingering difficulties that are still present through the workplace, politics, crime and violence, as well as religious views and migration. Regarding social changes, there are some notable evidences such as same-sex marriage, international human rights politics, current parallelism between conservative and resistant activism in global and local settings, the politicization and depoliticization of violent experiences in law reforms, and lastly, the persistent and technology of homophobic behaviors in social institutions like education. So that will be all, and thank you for listening. We are sincerely thanks coming from us, Group 7, for giving us your time.